Imagine that for a second. Everything you believe to be real, your body, the objects around you, even time itself, is only the surface. Like the tip of an iceberg floating above the water. Solid, familiar, convincing. But beneath it, something invisible is holding everything in place. What supports all of this? What allows reality to exist at all? The answer lies in the quantum field. And no, this isn't a movie theory or a poetic metaphor. It's real science, just not the kind most people were ever taught to understand. So why has no one explained it to you like this before? Maybe because it's usually presented in a cold, distant way, buried under formulas, symbols, and language that feels disconnected from real life. The human meaning gets lost, but the truth about the quantum field is actually simpler and much deeper than that. What if understanding it isn't about learning complex physics, but about seeing your own life differently? What if it changes how you relate to your thoughts, your emotions, your energy, and even the choices you make every day? Because once you start looking beneath the surface, reality stops feeling random and starts feeling connected. At some point, you've probably heard the phrase, "Everything is vibrating." It sounds poetic, maybe even vague, so the mind quickly dismisses it as something symbolic. But this isn't a metaphor meant to make you feel inspired. It's a literal description of how reality behaves beneath what your senses report. Look closely at anything you call solid: your hand, a chair, the floor under your feet. What feels firm and stable is, at a deeper level, an organized movement. Atoms aren't tiny hard balls stacked together. They're patterns of energy, mostly empty space held in form by forces that never stop moving. If you could zoom in far enough, there would be no stillness to find. Only motion, oscillation, exchange. That's what vibration means here. Not something mystical floating in the air, but constant activity, a kind of silent music playing everywhere, even in what appears quiet. The reason you don't notice it is the same reason you don't notice the earth spinning. Your nervous system evolved to focus on survival, not on perceiving the full depth of reality. This matters because it changes what you think you are. If everything is vibration, then you are not a fixed object moving through a dead world. You are a dynamic process inside a larger process. Your body is a rhythm, your thoughts are rhythms, your emotions are rhythms, and all of them are interacting with the rhythms around you, whether you're aware of it or not. Science has been circling this idea for over a century. At the quantum level, particles behave more like waves than like objects. They don't have a single position until they interact. They exist as probabilities, as tendencies, as vibrations in a field. What we call matter is what happens when those vibrations stabilize into a pattern that lasts long enough for us to name it. That stability can fool you. It creates the impression that the world is static and separate from you. But separation is an interpretation, not a fact. The same underlying field that gives rise to a star also gives rise to your nervous system. The difference isn't substance, it's organization and frequency. You can feel this without believing anything new. Think about how your body responds to a room. Some places make you tense without explanation. Others make you breathe deeper. No one announces why. Your body just knows. That's vibration, translated into sensation. Your system is constantly reading the environment and adjusting, long before your rational mind catches up. The same is true internally. A thought isn't just a sentence in your head. It's an electrical and chemical event. An emotion isn't abstract. It has weight, temperature, speed. Anxiety tightens and accelerates. Calm slows and opens. These are shifts in internal rhythm. You don't need to label them as high or low. So you only need to notice that they feel different because they are different patterns of energy. Here's where many people get confused. They hear that everything is vibration and assume it means they need to force themselves into a certain state. Smile more, think better thoughts, stay positive. But forcing a vibration doesn't work, because force itself has a frequency. Tension carries its own signal. Pretending to feel something you don't creates internal noise, not coherence. A more honest approach is observation. Notice how your state changes throughout the day. Notice what speeds you up and what settles you. Notice how your body reacts before your mind explains. This isn't about control, it's about sensitivity. When you become more sensitive, you start to recognize that you're always broadcasting something, even in silence. There's a simple experiment you can try right now. Don't change anything. Just pause for a few breaths and feel the space inside your chest. Not the idea of it, the sensation. Is it tight, open, neutral? That sensation is vibration made personal. It's information. And it's always there, even when you're busy ignoring it. This doesn't mean the universe rearranges itself instantly around your mood. That's a fantasy version of the idea. What actually happens is subtler and more grounded. Your dominant patterns influence your perception, your decisions, and the timing of your actions. Over time, those small shifts change the trajectory of your life, not by magic, but by resonance. When two systems vibrate in harmony, they exchange energy efficiently. When they don't, energy is lost as friction. You've felt this in conversations, in relationships, in work. Some interactions flow, others drain you. That's not moral, it's mechanical. It's how systems behave. Understanding this reframes responsibility. You're not responsible for controlling the whole field. You're responsible for the quality of coherence inside your own system. And coherence doesn't come from trying harder. It comes from reducing internal conflict, from letting thoughts, emotions, and actions align instead of pulling in opposite directions. As you begin to see yourself as vibration, rather than as a fixed identity, another illusion starts to loosen its grip. The illusion of solidity itself. The idea that the world is made of hard, separate things begins to soften. And once that happens, a deeper question naturally arises. If matter is mostly empty space organized by invisible forces, then what does solid really mean at all? Go ahead and press your hand against a table or a wall. There's a sense of resistance, a clear boundary. Your brain immediately labels it as solid, real, unquestionable. From childhood, this feeling becomes proof. What resists your touch must be firmly there. But that certainty is built on how your senses evolved, not on how reality is actually structured. At the microscopic level, what you're touching is nothing like what it seems. The atoms in your hand never truly collide with the atoms in the wall. What you feel as solidity is the interaction of electromagnetic forces pushing against each other, fields repelling fields, no contact in the way your intuition imagines it. The sensation of hardness is your nervous system translating invisible forces into something it can understand quickly. This is where the illusion begins. Not because the world isn't real, but because your experience of it is simplified for survival. Your senses compress an incredibly complex process into something manageable. If you had to perceive the constant motion, the empty space, the instability of matter, you wouldn't be able to function. So your brain tells a useful story. This is solid, this is separate, this is stable. Yet beneath that story, everything is provisional. Atoms are mostly empty space. Nuclei are tiny relative to the distance between them. Electrons don't orbit like little planets. They exist as probability clouds, as tendencies. Matter holds together not because it's dense, but because forces are balanced in just the right way. Solidity is an agreement, not a substance. This doesn't make the world fragile or unreal. It makes it relational. What exists does so through interaction. Remove the forces, change the balance, and what looked permanent reorganizes itself. Ice becomes water. Water becomes vapor. The substance didn't vanish, the pattern did. Your body follows the same logic. It feels continuous, like a single object moving through time. But in reality, it's a flow. Cells die and are replaced. Molecules come and go. Even the atoms that make you up today are not the same ones from years ago. The sense of a fixed me is another useful compression, not a literal truth. This can be unsettling at first. The mind wants something solid to hold on to, something permanent. But there's also a quiet relief hidden in this realization. If solidity is an appearance rather than an essence, then rigidity isn't required. Life doesn't need to be held together by force. It holds itself through balance. You can notice this in moments when control loosens. Think of times when you stopped trying to manage every detail, and things still worked out. Not perfectly, but adequately. There was movement, adjustment, response. The world didn't collapse. That's because reality isn't a stack of bricks waiting to fall. It's a living process, constantly correcting itself. The illusion of solid matter trains us to approach life as if everything must be pushed or defended. We brace ourselves. We harden our opinions. We treat relationships, identities, and even emotions as fixed structures. But those too are patterns, not objects. When treated as rigid, they crack. When allowed to move, they adapt. This doesn't mean nothing matters. It means meaning arises from patterns, not permanence. A wave doesn't need to be frozen to be real. Its reality is in its motion. In the same way, your experiences don't need to last forever to be valid. Their value is in how they shape the flow of your attention and your choices. There's a subtle shift that happens when this sinks in. You start to listen differently to your body. Tension isn't a flaw, it's information. Fatigue isn't weakness. It's a signal that a pattern has been held too tightly for too long. Even emotional pain changes character when you stop seeing it as a solid block and start seeing it as energy moving through you. Try noticing how quickly sensations change when you stop resisting them. A discomfort that seemed fixed begins to soften when you observe it without naming it as permanent. This isn't imagination. It's how dynamic systems behave when they're allowed to complete their cycles instead of being frozen by judgment. The idea of solidity also shapes how we think about the world out there. We assume reality is something finished, something already formed, and that we're merely navigating it. But if matter itself is an ongoing process, then the world is less like a stage and more like a field in motion, stable enough to walk on, flexible enough to respond. Once you stop taking solidity at face value, a new question quietly emerges. If what looks solid is actually a pattern sustained by deeper forces, then where do those forces exist? Not in the objects themselves, but in something more fundamental that holds all patterns at once. And that points attention beyond individual things toward the invisible matrix that allows anything to appear at all. If everything you see is a pattern rather than a solid thing, then the next question is unavoidable. Where do these patterns exist before they take shape? They don't float independently in empty space. They emerge from something deeper, something that doesn't look like an object at all. This is where the idea of the quantum field stops being abstract and starts becoming practical. Instead of imagining the universe as a collection of separate things, physics describes it as a continuous field. Not many fields stacked together, but a unified background that fills all space. Particles are not little dots moving through this field. They are temporary excitations of it, like ripples on the surface of water. The ripple isn't separate from the ocean. It is the ocean, momentarily expressing itself in a particular way. This changes the meaning of existence. Nothing truly exists on its own. Everything exists as a relationship within the field. A particle appears because conditions allow it to appear. It disappears when those conditions change. What remains constant is not the object, but the field itself. When people hear the word field, they often imagine something distant or exotic. But fields are already familiar to you. Gravity is a field. Magnetism is a field. You don't see them directly, but you see their effects. The quantum field is similar, except it's more fundamental. It doesn't just influence matter, it gives rise to it. From this perspective, space is not empty. What we call empty space is actually full of potential. It's alive with fluctuations, even in what looks like complete stillness. Something is always happening beneath the surface, even when nothing appears to be happening at all. This has profound implications for how you see yourself. Your body is not sitting inside the field, like an object placed in a container. Your body is an expression of the field. So is your brain. So are the electrical signals that become thoughts. There is no clear boundary where you end and the field begins. The boundary is conceptual, not physical. That's why separation feels so convincing and yet so unstable. On one level, you clearly have a body, a name, a history. On another level, everything that makes you up is in constant exchange with the environment. Air becomes breath, food becomes cells, sound becomes neural activity. You are not sealed off from the world, you are in conversation with it. The quantum field is often described as a space of potential. This doesn't mean that anything can happen at any time. It means that multiple possibilities exist simultaneously until conditions favor one over the others. Reality is not pre-written in detail. It is continuously selected from a range of options. This is where consciousness enters the picture, carefully and without exaggeration. Observation matters, not because the mind magically creates particles, but because interaction shapes outcomes. Measurement, attention, and context influence how potential becomes actual. The observer is not outside the system. The observer is part of the field interacting with itself. You see a quiet version of this every day. When you expect a conversation to go badly, you show up tense, guarded, less open. The interaction often follows that tone. When you're relaxed and attentive, different possibilities emerge. The situation didn't change because of wishful thinking. It changed because your state altered the conditions of the interaction. The quantum field works in a similar way, but at a deeper level. It doesn't respond to surface-level wishes or forced optimism. It responds to coherence. When elements align, energy flows more efficiently. When they don't, things feel stuck or noisy. This is why trying to use the field usually backfires. Effort rooted in fear or control adds interference. It's like trying to calm water by hitting it harder. The field isn't impressed by intensity. It responds to clarity. There's an important distinction here. The field is not a conscious being deciding what you deserve. It doesn't reward or punish. It mirrors. It reflects the patterns that are most stable and consistent within you. Not the ones you perform, but the ones you live in. You can sense this by noticing how certain states feel sustainable and others don't. A forced attitude drains energy. A genuine alignment restores it. This isn't moral or spiritual, it's structural. Systems tend toward coherence because coherence is efficient. Once you begin to see the quantum field as the matrix where everything exists, life stops feeling like a series of isolated events. Choices echo. States carry forward. Small shifts matter because they alter the pattern you're reinforcing. You're no longer asking how to control outcomes, but how to align conditions. And this leads naturally to a realization that can feel surprising at first. You don't need to connect to the field. You never left it. The real question is why it often feels like you're separate, as if you're acting alone in a vast universe that isn't listening. That sense of disconnection isn't a physical problem. It's a perceptual one, rooted in how attention has been trained. The idea that you need to connect to the quantum field is one of the most persistent misunderstandings. It sounds reasonable at first, almost logical. If the field is something vast and subtle, then surely you must reach it, activate it, tune into it. But that assumption is built on the same illusion of separation that shaped everything before. You imagine yourself here and the field somewhere else. In reality, there has never been a gap. You are not outside the field trying to enter it. You are already inside it, the way a wave is inside the ocean. You don't connect to the ocean by effort. You are made of it. The same field that gives rise to particles, forces, and space itself is the one expressing itself as your body, your nervous system, your awareness in this moment. Nothing special needs to happen for this to be true. It is already the case while you're distracted, while you're doubting, while you're reading these words. Connection is not an achievement. It's a condition. The feeling of disconnection comes from attention, not from reality. When attention narrows, when it locks onto problems, identities, and stories, the field fades into the background. Not because it disappears, but because you stop noticing the context and focus only on the content. It's like watching a movie and forgetting the screen exists. The screen never leaves. Your awareness just collapses into the story. Your body constantly proves this connection, quietly and without philosophy. Every second, it adjusts to gravity without calculation. It balances temperature. It synchronizes with light and dark. It responds to sound, presence, threat, safety. These adjustments are not conscious decisions. They are field-level interactions happening automatically. Even your thoughts are not as private as they seem. They arise from electrical activity, chemistry, memory, environment. A change in sleep alters them. A change in nutrition alters them. A change in emotional context alters them. Thought feels personal, but it is embedded in a larger web of influence. That web is the field expressing itself locally. This is why forcing a sense of connection often leads to frustration. The effort itself reinforces the belief that something is missing. The mind tries to reach what is already here, like a person searching for glasses while wearing them. The more effort you apply, the more distance you create. A subtler approach is noticing when connection feels most obvious, not in peak moments but in ordinary ones. In the quiet after a deep breath, in the way your body relaxes when you stop arguing internally, in moments when attention widens and the sense of me versus world softens even briefly. Those moments aren't special states, they're absences of interference. When noise drops, signal becomes clear. The field doesn't get stronger, your resistance gets weaker. This is also why intense effort, constant striving, and over-control tend to feel draining. They fragment attention. They pull different parts of you in opposite directions. The field responds to coherence, not to strain. And coherence is not something you force. It's something that happens when you stop contradicting yourself internally. Notice how often the body knows before the mind, a subtle tightening before a decision you'll later regret, a sense of ease before a choice that aligns. These signals aren't mystical. They're integrated responses from a system that has access to more information than conscious thought alone. The field communicates through sensation long before it becomes language. This doesn't mean every impulse is truth. Conditioning exists, bias exists, fear can masquerade as intuition. That's why awareness matters. Not to control the field, but to listen more accurately, to distinguish between noise and signal, between reaction and resonance. When people talk about being in alignment, they often imagine a dramatic shift, but alignment usually feels simple, quiet, unremarkable. It's the absence of inner friction, the sense that you're not forcing yourself into a shape that doesn't fit. You don't need to amplify anything to be connected. You need to stop constantly overriding what's already happening. The field is not impressed by intensity. It doesn't respond to how badly you want something. It responds to the pattern you consistently embody. And this is where things become uncomfortable for many people. If you're always connected, then the field isn't ignoring you. It's responding accurately, not to your intentions on paper, but to your lived state, to the emotional baseline you return to the assumptions you carry without questioning. This realization isn't meant to create guilt. It's meant to restore agency. If connection is constant, then change doesn't start by reaching outward. It starts by noticing what you're already broadcasting, not occasionally, but habitually. You are not waiting for a signal from the universe. You are already in the signal. The real question is not whether the field is listening, but why your experience so often feels disconnected from what you say you want. And that question leads directly into a subtle but critical misunderstanding about how thoughts actually influence reality, and why simply thinking positive rarely works the way people expect. At some point, almost everyone asks this quietly, sometimes with frustration, sometimes with guilt. If thoughts shape reality, why isn't mine changing the way I want? You've visualized, you've repeated affirmations, you've tried to think better, and yet the same patterns seem to return. This doesn't mean the idea is false. It means the way it's usually explained is incomplete. A thought by itself is a very light signal. It's brief, fleeting, and often contradicted by another thought seconds later. The mind produces thousands of them every day, many of which cancel each other out. When people say your thoughts create reality, they often imagine each thought as a command sent into the universe. But reality doesn't respond to isolated commands. It responds to patterns. What shapes experience is not what you think occasionally, but what you inhabit consistently. Your dominant state matters more than your best intentions. You can repeat words of confidence while your body remains tense. You can picture abundance while carrying a constant sense of urgency or lack. In those cases, the louder signal isn't the thought. It's the underlying emotional and physiological state. The field doesn't read language. It reads coherence. It responds to the alignment between your thoughts, your emotions, and your behavior. When those elements pull in different directions, the signal becomes noisy. Not wrong, just unclear. This is why positive thinking often feels exhausting. It asks you to layer a new idea on top of an old state without addressing the state itself. The result is internal conflict. One part of you is trying to project confidence, while another is bracing for disappointment. The field responds to the overall pattern, not to the surface message. There's also the issue of identity. Many thoughts are attempts to escape a feeling rather than expressions of truth. Wanting something intensely can sometimes reinforce the sense that you don't have it. The desire itself becomes a reminder of absence. Subtly, the system keeps broadcasting "not yet," even while the words say "now." This doesn't mean desire is bad. It means unexamined desire can work against itself. When wanting is driven by fear, comparison, or urgency, it carries a contraction. That contraction is part of the signal. Another layer people rarely consider is habit. Your nervous system learns through repetition. If you've spent years expecting certain outcomes, avoiding certain risks, or bracing for certain disappointments, those expectations become embodied. They show up in posture, tone, timing, and decision-making. Long before a conscious thought appears, the body has already set the direction. So when a new thought enters, it doesn't land on neutral ground. It lands inside an established pattern. If the pattern is strong, the thought either fades or gets reshaped to fit it. This is why insight alone rarely changes a life. Insight must be absorbed into the body, into behavior, into rhythm. There's also a subtle bias at work. When people try to use thoughts to control outcomes, they often monitor reality too closely. They scan for signs, measure progress constantly, and interpret delays as failure. This monitoring reinforces tension. It keeps attention locked on what's missing. The field doesn't respond well to being watched with suspicion. Contrast that with moments when things fall into place without effort. You weren't trying to make them happen. You were engaged, present, and responsive. Your actions were timely because your attention wasn't split. That's not coincidence, that's coherence. None of this means you should stop thinking intentionally. It means thinking is only one layer of influence. Thoughts are most powerful when they emerge from a state rather than trying to create one. When clarity precedes intention, the signal becomes cleaner. A useful shift is to stop asking, "Why isn't this working?" and start asking, "What state am I rehearsing every day?" Not in words, but in sensations, in pace, in how you relate to uncertainty, in how quickly you tense when something doesn't go as planned. You don't change reality by demanding different results. You change it by stabilizing a different internal pattern and letting actions follow naturally from that. The field responds to what you return to, not to what you visit briefly. This realization can be uncomfortable because it removes the fantasy of instant control, but it also removes blame. You're not failing at manifestation. You're learning how influence actually works. And once you see that thoughts are only effective when they're supported by an aligned inner state, another issue becomes obvious. If alignment matters more than effort, then the constant need to control outcomes might be doing more harm than good. And that opens the door to a deeper question about why trying so hard often creates resistance instead of results. Control feels responsible, it feels mature, it feels like the way an intelligent person should move through life. Plan ahead, anticipate risks, manage outcomes. From the outside, control looks like strength. Inside the body, though, it often feels like tension held just below the surface, a constant readiness for things to go wrong. The habit of control usually begins as protection. At some point, uncertainty hurt. Something unexpected happened, and the nervous system learned a lesson. Don't let that happen again. So the mind stepped in and started working overtime. It began scanning, predicting, rehearsing. Control became a strategy to reduce fear. The problem is that the strategy outlives the danger. What starts as protection slowly becomes interference. When you try to control reality, you assume it is something external that must be managed from the outside. You position yourself against life instead of within it. Every outcome becomes a test. Every delay feels like resistance, and every surprise is interpreted as a threat. This internal posture has a cost. Control tightens attention. It narrows perception. When you're trying to manage everything, you stop listening. You react instead of responding. You push when timing calls for waiting, and you hold on when movement is needed. The field doesn't respond well to this kind of pressure, not because it's punishing you, but because pressure creates noise. Control fragments your system. One part of you is pushing forward, another is bracing, another is doubting. The signal becomes incoherent. Think about moments when control has worked best. They're usually limited, mechanical situations, following instructions, executing a known task. But life itself is not mechanical. It's adaptive. It changes as you interact with it. Trying to control an adaptive system often produces the opposite result. You can see this clearly in relationships. The more you try to control how someone feels, the more distance appears. The more you try to manage how you're perceived, the less authentic you feel. Control creates stiffness, and stiffness breaks connection. Inside your own body, the same thing happens. When you try to control emotions instead of feeling them, they persist longer. When you try to force calm, anxiety tightens. When you try to think your way out of uncertainty, the mind spins faster. The effort itself becomes the obstacle. This is because control is rooted in mistrust. It assumes that if you don't intervene constantly, things will fall apart. That assumption shapes your state, and that state is what the field responds to. Surrender, in this context, is often misunderstood. It's not passivity. It's not giving up. It's releasing unnecessary force. It's allowing intelligence beyond conscious thought to participate. Your body already knows how to do this. When you stop interfering with breathing, it finds its rhythm. When you stop forcing sleep, it comes naturally. These are not failures of control, they're successes of cooperation. The same principle applies to decision-making. Some of the best choices you've made likely didn't come from overthinking. They came from clarity that appeared when you stopped pushing. Not because you stopped caring, but because you stopped strangling the process. Control tries to collapse the future into certainty, but reality doesn't operate that way. It unfolds through feedback. You act, you observe, you adjust. When you demand certainty before acting, you freeze. When you demand guarantees, you miss timing. The field responds to responsiveness, not rigidity. It favors systems that can adapt, not systems that insist on fixed outcomes. There's also an identity cost to control. Over time, you start believing that your worth depends on managing everything well. Mistakes feel personal. Uncertainty feels like failure. Rest feels undeserved. This creates a chronic baseline of effort, even when nothing urgent is happening. And effort, when sustained without rest, becomes resistance. Letting go of control doesn't mean abandoning intention. It means holding intention without tension. It means setting a direction and remaining sensitive to feedback instead of forcing a straight line. It means trusting that you can respond intelligently to what emerges, even if you can't predict it perfectly. This trust isn't blind optimism. It's built through observation, through noticing that life has continued to support movement even when plans changed, that you've adapted before, that you're not as fragile as control would suggest. When control loosens, something else becomes noticeable. There's more space between stimulus and response, more room to sense timing, more quiet inside the mind. In that quiet, guidance doesn't arrive as loud instructions, it arrives as subtle alignment. And that quiet is not empty, it's full of information that was always there but drowned out by effort. Which is why the next shift isn't about doing more or thinking harder, but about understanding the role of stillness itself, and why silence often carries more power than constant action. Noise feels productive. It feels like movement, like engagement, like being involved in life. Thoughts racing, plans forming, words filling the space. Silence, by contrast, often feels empty or even uncomfortable. Many people avoid it without realizing they are doing so. They keep something playing, something scrolling, something demanding attention. Not because they enjoy the noise, but because silence removes distraction, and distraction has been doing an important job. Noise keeps you identified with the surface of things, with opinions, worries, explanations, rehearsals. It gives the mind something to chew on, so it doesn't have to feel uncertainty directly. Silence takes that buffer away, and when it does, what remains is raw information. This is why silence has power. Not mystical power, but informational power. When the noise drops, signals that were always present become detectable. subtle sensations in the body, shifts in emotion, a quiet sense of rightness or wrongness that doesn't come as words. Think about moments when insight arrived unexpectedly, in the shower, while walking, just before sleep. These weren't moments of intense thinking. They were moments when the mind relaxed its grip. Silence created space, and in that space coherence could form. The nervous system is constantly processing far more than conscious thought can handle. Patterns, risks, opportunities, timing. When the mind is loud, it interrupts that process. It insists on running the show even when it doesn't have all the data. Silence allows other forms of intelligence to participate. This doesn't mean silence is always comfortable. Often, the first thing that appears when things get quiet is tension. Unfinished emotions, unresolved questions. The mind interprets this as a problem and rushes to fill the space again. But that discomfort isn't a sign that silence is wrong. It's a sign that something has been waiting to be felt. Silence is not the absence of experience. It's the absence of interference. You can observe this in the body. When you stop talking internally for a moment, even briefly, you may notice your breath change on its own. Muscles soften without instruction. The body rebalances when it's no longer being micromanaged. This isn't relaxation as a technique. It's relaxation as a natural state, returning when effort drops. The field responds the same way. Constant mental activity creates static, opinions layered on opinions, judgments on top of judgments. The signal becomes crowded. Silence doesn't send a message. It clears the channel. This is why stillness often feels more aligned than action taken from agitation. Action born from silence tends to be simpler and more precise. Fewer words, better timing, less waste. You've likely noticed that when you speak from a calm place, fewer explanations are needed. The message carries itself. Noise, on the other hand, creates urgency. It pushes decisions before they're ready. It confuses movement with progress. Silence slows perception just enough for you to sense direction instead of forcing it. There's also a deeper reason silence matters. Identity itself is reinforced by constant narration. The story of who you are, what you believe, what you fear, what you want. Silence loosens that story. For a moment, you're not defending an identity or chasing an outcome. You're just present. In those moments, separation softens. You're less of a commentator and more of a participant. Less outside of life, more inside it. The field doesn't feel distant then, it feels immediate. Not as an idea, but as responsiveness. This doesn't require long retreats or dramatic practices. Even brief pauses change the quality of attention. A few seconds without filling the gap. A breath without trying to control it. A moment of listening instead of preparing the next thought. These are small acts, but they shift the internal environment. Silence also reveals something important about effort. When you stop trying to produce a certain state, the system often organizes itself better than when you're forcing it. Calm that is allowed is more stable than calm that is imposed. Clarity that emerges is more reliable than clarity that is argued into existence. The modern world treats silence as inefficiency, as wasted time. But from the perspective of alignment, silence is where recalibration happens. It's where scattered signals resync. It's where the noise of habit drops enough for new information to surface. And that information rarely comes as abstract insight. It comes as feeling, a sense of ease or tension, expansion or contraction, warmth or heaviness. The body speaks before the mind translates, which means silence doesn't lead you into emptiness. It leads you into sensation. This is where the next layer becomes unavoidable. If silence clears the channel, then what moves through that channel most clearly is not thought, but emotion. Not as drama, but as data. Because emotion is the form through which the field communicates most directly with the human system. Emotions are often treated as side effects, something that happens after events, after thoughts, after decisions. We talk about them as reactions, as if they were late to the scene. But in reality, emotions are closer to the center of the process than most people realize. They are not commentary, they are communication. Before a thought fully forms, the body already knows. A tightening in the chest, a heaviness in the stomach, a sense of openness or a subtle pull back. These signals appear faster than language, because they are not meant to be analyzed first. They are meant to be felt. Emotion is how information moves through a biological system connected to a much larger field. This is why emotions don't respond well to being argued with. You can reason all day and still feel uneasy. You can understand why you shouldn't feel something, and yet it persists. That's because emotion isn't trying to convince you of anything. It's informing you. And information doesn't disappear just because you disagree with it. The quantum field doesn't operate in words or concepts. It operates in patterns, in coherence, in movement. Emotions are the closest human equivalent to that language. They are patterns of energy moving through the nervous system, translating interaction with the field into sensation. Fear, for example, is not just a mental story. It's a whole body state. Muscles contract, breathing changes, attention narrows. The system prepares for threat. Gratitude does the opposite. It opens perception. It slows the system down just enough to register support. These are not symbolic states. They are physical configurations, and those configurations shape how you interact with the world. When people say the field responds to emotion, it's easy to misunderstand this as reward and punishment, as if feeling good earns good outcomes and feeling bad attracts bad ones. That framing creates pressure and guilt, which only adds more noise. The reality is simpler and more precise. The field reflects coherence. Emotions indicate whether your internal system is in harmony or in conflict. When an emotion is steady and integrated, the signal is clear. When emotions are suppressed, denied, or overridden, the signal becomes distorted. This is why emotional honesty matters more than emotional positivity. Pretending to feel calm while your body is braced sends mixed information. One layer says, "I'm fine," another says, "I'm not safe." The field doesn't choose between them. It responds to the total pattern. Many people try to use emotions strategically. They attempt to generate gratitude, confidence, or joy as tools to get something. But emotions don't work well when they're instrumentalized. They become performative instead of informative. The body knows the difference. A genuine emotion arises when experience is allowed to register fully. Even emotions we label as negative carry useful data. Sadness slows you down so something can be processed. Anger mobilizes energy around a violated boundary. Fear sharpens attention. These states become problematic not because they exist, but because they are resisted or prolonged beyond their natural cycle. When emotion is allowed to move, it completes its function. When it's blocked, it loops. The field doesn't punish you for looping emotions. It simply continues to reflect the pattern that's being reinforced. This is why emotional awareness is more powerful than emotional control. Awareness allows movement. Control freezes it. And frozen emotion doesn't disappear. It embeds itself into posture, habits, expectations, and choices. Notice how your emotional baseline influences what feels possible. When you're anxious, options shrink. When you're at ease, options expand. The external world may be the same, but your access to it changes. This is not imagination. It's how perception works. The field responds to this perceptual shift because your actions, timing, and openness change with it. You notice different opportunities. You interpret signals differently. You take different risks. Emotion doesn't override reality. It filters it. There's an important bias to watch for here. It's tempting to believe that feeling a certain way guarantees a certain outcome. That's another form of control, just disguised as spirituality. Emotions don't command the field. They tune your system within it. Think of emotion less as a lever and more as a dial. It doesn't force results. It adjusts sensitivity, and sensitivity determines what you can respond to effectively. This is why emotional regulation is not about suppression or amplification. It's about clarity. Can you feel what's present without immediately acting it out or pushing it away? Can you stay with sensation long enough for it to inform you instead of rushing to escape it? As that capacity grows, emotions stop feeling like obstacles and start feeling like guidance. Not dramatic guidance, quiet, practical guidance, a sense of when to speak and when to wait, when to move and when to pause, when something fits and when it doesn't. And here's the part that changes how you relate to the field entirely. Emotions are not judged, not by the field, not by reality itself. They are read, not evaluated. They are responded to, not moralized, which means the field is not keeping score of your good and bad feelings. It is simply mirroring the state you are consistently inhabiting. Understanding that removes a lot of unnecessary pressure. You don't need to fix yourself emotionally to be worthy of alignment. You need to listen accurately. Because once you see that emotions are information, not verdicts, it becomes clear that the field is not deciding anything about you. It is responding to what you are already expressing, moment by moment. Judgment is a human habit. We learned it early, often as a way to stay safe. Good and bad, right and wrong, allowed and forbidden. These distinctions helped us navigate social systems, but over time they seeped into how we interpret reality itself. We start to believe that life is evaluating us, that the universe is keeping a ledger, that outcomes are rewards or punishments for who we are or how well we behaved. The quantum field doesn't work that way. It has no preference, no opinion, no moral framework. It doesn't pause to decide what you deserve. It responds the same way a mirror responds. Whatever pattern is most consistently present is the one that gets reflected back. Not because it's right or wrong, but because it's there. This is difficult for the mind to accept, because judgment is how the mind creates order. If something good happens, the mind wants credit. If something painful happens, it looks for blame. But the field operates below that level. It's not concerned with stories, it's concerned with states. When you touch a hot surface, the burn isn't a punishment, it's a response. Heat meets skin, energy transfers, and a result occurs. No intention, no evaluation, just interaction. The field responds to emotional and physiological states in a similar way, not as consequences in a moral sense, but as outcomes of resonance. This is why guilt and shame are such heavy signals, not because they are bad emotions, but because they fold attention inward in a constricting way. They collapse posture, narrow perception, and create self-surveillance. When those states become habitual, they shape how you move, decide, and relate. The field reflects that constriction, not as judgment, but as reduced options and increased friction. The same applies to pride, urgency, or desperation. Any state that locks the system into a narrow band of response limits what can emerge. The field doesn't reject you for being there. It simply mirrors the bandwidth you're operating within. Understanding this can be deeply liberating. If the field doesn't judge, then you are not being tested. You are not failing some cosmic exam. You are learning how patterns work. And learning doesn't require self-punishment. It requires feedback. Feedback is neutral. It tells you what is happening when you do what you're doing from the state you're in. That's it. When you change the state, the feedback changes. This reframes responsibility in a healthier way. Responsibility is not about blaming yourself for outcomes. It's about recognizing influence. You are not in control of everything, but you are participating in everything. Your state matters because it shapes interaction, not because it earns approval. Many people secretly believe that if they suffer enough, the universe will notice and compensate, or that if they stay positive enough, they'll avoid pain. Both beliefs assume judgment. Both lead to exhaustion. The field doesn't bargain, it responds. You can see this clearly in daily life. When you're calm and present, conversations tend to flow more easily. When you're tense and defensive, misunderstandings multiply. The other person isn't judging you. The interaction is simply reflecting the state each of you brings into it. The same principle applies internally. When you judge your own emotions, they persist. When you meet them without condemnation, they move, not because you allowed them morally, but because you stopped adding resistance. Resistance is often mistaken for discipline, but resistance is a form of judgment. It says, "This shouldn't be happening." The field doesn't agree or disagree. It responds to the added tension. This is why self-compassion is not a soft concept here. It's a practical one. When you stop judging your internal states, coherence improves. The signal becomes clearer. Decisions get simpler. Timing improves. Not because you're being rewarded for kindness, but because the system has less internal conflict. The absence of judgment also means there is no final verdict about who you are. States are temporary. Patterns can shift, nothing is locked in. The field is constantly updating based on current conditions, not past mistakes. That doesn't mean consequences disappear. Actions still matter. Patterns still carry momentum. But consequences are not character assessments. They are information about alignment. Once you really see that the field only responds, a subtle shift occurs. You stop trying to perform for reality. You stop asking whether you're doing it right. You start paying attention instead to what's happening, to how your system feels, to what changes when you change. This attention is quieter than self-judgment. It's more curious, less dramatic, and it opens the door to something science itself has been grappling with for decades. If the field doesn't judge but does respond, and if observation changes outcomes, then what exactly has modern science discovered about this interaction between observer and reality? When people talk about the quantum field, it's easy to assume this is all philosophy layered on top of science. But long before these ideas entered popular language, physics itself ran into something unexpected. Not mystical, not spiritual in the traditional sense, but deeply unsettling to the old way of seeing the world. At the beginning of the 20th century, scientists believed reality was predictable if you had enough information. Objects had properties, particles had positions, causes produced effects in a straight line. Then experiments began to show cracks in that picture. One of the most famous is the double-slit experiment. When particles like electrons are fired toward a screen with two small openings, they don't behave like tiny bullets. They behave like waves, spreading out and creating interference patterns. That alone was strange, but what truly shook physics was what happened when observation entered the picture. When no one measured which slit the particle passed through, the wave-like pattern appeared. When measurement was added, the pattern collapsed, and the particles behaved like individual objects. The act of observation changed the outcome, not metaphorically, measurably. This wasn't about human consciousness in a romantic sense, it was about interaction. Measurement required coupling the system to something else, and that coupling altered behavior. Reality wasn't independent of how it was observed, it was participatory. Another discovery pushed this even further: quantum entanglement. Two particles interact and then separate by great distances. According to classical thinking, they should behave independently afterward. But they don't. Measure one, and the other responds instantly, regardless of distance. Not through a signal traveling between them, but as if they are still part of a single system. Einstein famously called this spooky action at a distance, not because it was magical, but because it violated the assumptions of separation and locality. Experiments since then have repeatedly confirmed it. Reality, at a fundamental level, is non-local. Parts of the system remain correlated even when space separates them. What science learned from this wasn't that everything is mind-created, but that the old picture of isolated objects moving in empty space was incomplete. The universe behaves more like an interconnected process than a collection of independent things. Another key shift came from quantum field theory itself. Particles were no longer treated as primary, fields were. What we call particles are excitations of underlying fields, momentary expressions of something more fundamental. The field is not inside space. Space emerges from the field. Even vacuum, once thought of as nothing, turned out to be full of activity. Fluctuations appear and disappear constantly. Energy is never truly at rest. The idea of absolute emptiness vanished. Neuroscience and biology, while operating at a different scale, echo similar principles. The brain is not a passive receiver of reality. It actively predicts, filters, and constructs experience. What you perceive is shaped by expectation, attention, and context. The observer is always involved. This doesn't mean reality is imaginary, it means perception is participatory. You never experience the world as it is. You experience an interaction between external signals and internal models. Change the model, and experience changes. Importantly, science has also been careful not to overreach. No serious physicist claims that wishing alone bends reality to your will. What science does show is more subtle and more grounded. Systems are sensitive to initial conditions. Observation influences outcomes. Interaction shapes emergence. The universe is not a static machine. It's dynamic, relational, and context-dependent. What's often missed is that this doesn't reduce mystery, it increases responsibility. If outcomes depend on interaction, then how you engage matters, not morally but mechanically. Attention, measurement, and context are part of the system, not outside it. Science also shows limits. There are probabilities, not guarantees. There is uncertainty baked into the structure of reality itself. The famous uncertainty principle isn't about flawed instruments, it's about the nature of the system. You cannot know everything at once. Precision in one dimension creates uncertainty in another. This aligns with lived experience more than we might admit. When you try to control every variable, something else slips. When you hold space for uncertainty, new patterns can emerge. What real science has uncovered is not a universe that obeys human desire, but a universe that responds to relationship. Interaction matters, context matters, participation matters, and perhaps the most important discovery is this. At the deepest level we can measure, reality is not made of things, but of interactions. Not objects, but processes. Not isolated points, but fields in motion. This doesn't tell you how to live. Science is careful about that. But it does quietly remove the idea that you are a detached observer moving through a fixed world. You are embedded in what you observe, part of what unfolds. And that realization, once it settles, changes how you listen, how you choose, and how you relate to the whole that you are never actually separate from. Everything shifts when you truly understand this. You are not moving through life alone, inside a world that is separate from you. You are part of the same process that gives rise to everything you see, feel, and experience. The quantum field is not something distant or abstract. It is the context of your existence. It is where your body, your thoughts, your emotions, and your choices are already taking place. When you stop seeing yourself as isolated, effort softens. You don't need to fight reality to belong in it. You begin to listen more, push less, and notice how small inner shifts create real changes in how life responds. Not because you are controlling the field, but because you are finally moving with it. If this perspective resonated with you, write this sentence in the comments. I remember that I am part of the whole. That lets me know you stayed until the end. And if you felt something open while listening, choose one of the videos appearing on the screen now. If you want more content like this, that's the best next step.